Good afternoon and welcome to the Atos webinar. Elevate your cyber resilience, navigate the evolving threat landscape. I hope you've brought your lunch today. My name is Vicky Matoga. I am the Head of Service Delivery and Operations. It's a great pleasure to be your host today. In my role, I have a front row seat to the challenges and opportunities that come with delivering secure, seamless services in an ever-increasing complex digital world. One thing is clear, the threat landscape is evolving faster than ever. From sophisticated cyber attacks to unexpected disruptions, organisations must be prepared to adapt and respond. That's why cyber resilience isn't just a buzzword, it's a business imperative. It's about building systems and strategies that not only defend against threats, but also recover quickly and continue to operate under pressure. Today, we will explore what it truly means to be resilient in the face of a cyber risk and how we can stay one step ahead. Before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping points. Today's webinar is recorded and will be made available to you after this session. The session will run for approximately 1 hour, with 45 minutes of content followed by a Q&A at the end. If we run out of time and are unable to answer your questions, we will respond via email. To ensure a smooth experience for everyone, all attendees are on mute and the chat function is disabled to minimise background noise. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel. You can submit your questions at any time during the session. I will read your questions out for our subject matter experts to answer, and all your questions will be anonymised to protect your confidentiality. Our two subject matter experts joining us today are Scott Gardner and Lee Noble. Let me take a moment to introduce them. Scott Gardner is an advisory lead in cyber defence with a wealth of experience in strategic cybersecurity engagements. He has worked closely with organisations to strengthen their security posture in an ever-evolving threat landscape. His deep industry expertise spans threat intelligence, security operations centre design, and resilience frameworks, making him a trusted advisor in today's evolving threat landscape. Lee Noble is a Principal Cybersecurity Officer in the Atos Security Operations Centre, with hands-on experience at the core of real-time threat detection and response. He leads the cyber emergency response team, working with clients to safeguard complex environments and ensure operation resilience and recover as quickly as possible from cyber incidents. Here is an overview of the topics we will be covering in today's agenda. Intro and welcome by yours truly, Vicky Matoga. May 2025, retail cyber attacks, what we know so far. That will be a combination of Scott and Lee. Number 3, what our organisations are doing to combat these types of threats. Again, a combination of Scott and Lee. And then finally, recommendations and final thoughts. And then I will take your questions and ask the SMEs to provide the answers. So why choose Atos? Cyber resilience is no longer operational. It's essential. Atos combines deep expertise, advanced technology, and a proactive approach to help organisations to stay ahead of threats, respond with confidence, and recover quickly. As a global trusted partner, we deliver unified protection and compliance across digital ecosystems while upholding the highest standards of digital sovereignty. We listen to our customers. We understand that every organisation is on a journey. and we are committed to being a partner at every stage of that journey. We manage, on average, 31 billion security events every day, backed by over 6,500 security professionals working in 18 global security operations centres around the world, and have more than 430 patents leading in the way in co-innovation with our partners and IP. Our leadership is consistently recognised through the numerous industry accreditations from Gartner, IDC, and Everest Group, to name a few. And when the world was watching, we demonstrated why Atos is the partner of choice. We are incredibly proud to be the IT partner for the Paris Olympics, now officially the most followed Olympic Games ever. Around 5 billion people turned in to witness the unforgettable magic of sport on one of the most high-profile digital stages in history. Atos's preparation had to reflect and respect the unwavering commitment made by the athletes, delivering the same precision and dedication by analysing 55 billion cybersecurity events and addressing over 1,000 security tickets, all with zero impact to the games. Both Scott and Lee were part of the winning team. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Scott to begin today's webinar. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the audience for taking the time to attend today. I hope you enjoy your lunch. If you're eating at the same time, we'll try and make it as entertaining as possible. So without further ado, I will start off. Right, so next slide, please. Okay, so as I'm sure most of the audience is aware, there were a number of high-profile, significant cyber attacks that have occurred within the UK in Q1. Specifically, we saw them hitting the public domain around April and May time of this year. Now, these were particularly I guess, impactful exploits of certain environments that actually enabled the adversaries to shut down two very high-profile operations in the retail sector. There was the third, which was Harrods, which we know about, but we haven't got as much data points around. But certainly, Marks and Spencers and Harrods appear to have been attacked by two known adversaries that are detailed on this slide. So the actual attacks, as the intelligence reports have been revealing, were initiated by Scattered Spider and Dragon Force. So what actually happened was, in terms of what the public perceived, there was two very large retail sector outfits that operations were effectively shut down. Now, this is not speculation, because we have reports to the effect that detail that ransomware was deployed within the Co-op and Marks and Spencers, and this was, a significant attack that actually managed to shut down their operations for a number of days, and the fallout is probably still being dealt with by those organisations. So what are these two groups? So Scattered Spider and Dragon Force, we get into a bit more detail around who they are, and what they do. But effectively, they managed to infiltrate the said environments, and they were quite brazen in the way they went about it. They actually compromised one of the suppliers that were actually delivering services into the environment, but then sent, to Co-op executives specifically evidence of the ransomware attack. So these guys were very brazen. They were looking for, publicity, which is why also attacks on the retail sector hit the news and the public domain very quickly, mainly because obviously, they're retail outfits that people interact with on a daily basis. The other thing to note is, why retail? Often when we look at like IT security spend across a lot of the verticals, so if you look at, manufacturing, financial services, CNI, etc., retail often spends some of the, lowest percentages in terms of overall IT spend on their cyber security. So it's not surprising that those outfits are targeted by these types of groups for a number of reasons. But the main one is obviously if you impact their operations, they get shut down. So everyone will be aware of that, because you cannot no longer interact with these actual retail outfits. That was the extent of the attack. And once they've actually achieved that, then it becomes public domain. It's all blown all over the news, and people become aware of these groups. So who are they? So Scattered Spider seems to be more of a what we call a more like financial sort of gain type threat actor, what we classify as tier 2 rather than tier 1, which is nation state. So they're slightly easier, less complex than some of the more rounded and robust outfits that you do see in terms of threat reports, especially if they're sponsored by state actors like the Chinese, North Korea, etc. So these guys are not the worst adversaries that you're going to come across. What they do typically, they try and infiltrate an environment. Once they've got a foothold within the environment, they will deploy ransomware, and then that locks the environment in almost a situation of compromise where it's nigh on impossible to recover from it unless you issue ransom to the ransomware demand people. And of course, that's very frowned upon now. And like there is new legislation that's coming in that will say that you should not pay ransomware attacks, which will be in the resilience bill that will be hitting the UK this September. The things to note here are that it was two groups, one of which more or less infiltrated the environment, which was Scattered Spider. We talk more around their tools, techniques, and procedures that they used to do that in later slides. And then after that, Dragon Force, which is the ransomware group, they took over a well-known dark web ransomware capability, which is a ransomware as a service, which basically means that anyone can potentially go and ask this ransomware group to and pay them to deploy their ransomware and use that as a platform to infiltrate and compromise various networks. So in summary, Scattered Spider opened up the attack vector, and then that was followed by the ransomware that was deployed into the environment. And then subsequently, as everyone saw on the news, operations were shut down. This obviously had a very, very damaging effect from a reputational perspective, but also operationally, in that these organizations could not function. And obviously that impacts their bottom line and all of the stuff that goes with that. And sometimes it can take a significant amount of time to recover, which they're probably still in the process of doing. So Lee, have you got anything to add on that so far?
Yeah, but I'll go into it a little bit more on the next slide, Scott, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so next slide, please. So who are Scattered Spider? So these are the guys that appear to have orchestrated the attack. They're an APT group. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat, and that term is tagged to some of these groups with another identifier for the use of within threat intelligence reports. We know they've been active since 2022. They're more motivated by financial gain. Like many adversary groups, they've got a number of aliases. Sometimes this is more sub-factions that might exist within the group. But this is a typical, I guess, pattern that we see of a number of groups coming together under one banner to initiate cyber attacks. So Scattered Spider were more focused, or at least what the threat reports we've seen identify, they're more focused in the UK, US, and Canada, with links to Russian threat actors. This is, of course, Scattered Spider. The ransomware group, Dragon Force, have got tight links into Malaysia, but that's just an FYI. 50% of the attacks that they've been initiating are targeting the financial sector, so they're more interested in financial gain. Obviously, as you're aware, they've branched out into retail, and then Lee will cover some other subsequent attacks that we've identified. But to be aware, these guys, even though they're not the most complex attackers, they are getting more sophisticated, and they've got fast evolving tools, techniques, and procedures to infiltrate environments. One thing that's very interesting in these specific attacks, again, was it was initiated in turn up front. The initial attack vector appears to have been a combination of social engineering and SIM swap, which we'll get onto in a bit more detail when Lee talks. But these guys do have a specialization in social engineering. Now, of course, it's very important to have a UK accent if you're trying to get someone at a service desk in the UK to try and do a password reset. So that's an advantage, and obviously clearly one of the things that we believe, and we've got data points to illustrate that this is what's happened. But yeah, SIM swap combined with social engineering, so a targeted attack on help desk, we believe through the supplier or one of the suppliers that was actually affiliated with the account, and then that resulted in the compromise. So Lee, do you want to talk a bit more around the TTPs of Scatter Spider?
Yeah, sure. So, as you've mentioned, they are specialists in social engineering. There are other threat actors which will be more specialized in taking advantage of vulnerabilities and moving around the environment that way. But that's usually sometimes easier to detect because they're leveraging a vulnerability which can be signatured, so you can detect that, and then they've got to find a privileged account to move onwards into the environment. With the fact that these are targeting administrators and using social engineering through service desks and alike to get a hold of that account, arguably it can be easier to hide within the noise of what a system admin is doing, because you wouldn't expect someone from accounting to be elevating privileges on a critical host, but you would expect that from a domain administrator. So it's just part of the play to hide between the noise. You mentioned SIM swap in there, and that can happen for a number of ways. Or in fact, just to even explain what a SIM swap is. So my mobile phone at the moment, obviously it's tied to me, my name, obviously I've got my phone number on there, and that could be used for multi-factor authentication. What a SIM swap is the ability to be able to manipulate your mobile phone provider in one way, shape, or form to move your identity from your SIM card to a blank SIM card that a threat actor can then purpose. A number of ways that can happen. Obviously, they can social engineer people within that mobile phone provider. There's stories of, previous stories of them being compromised and being able to access the backend systems to do these SIM swaps. Could be an insider threat within that organization. And then there's even some stories of young adults running into mobile phone shops and stealing the admin tablet to orchestrate the SIM swap on the tablet. As Scott mentioned, it's a lot to do with organized crime. So usually the individuals that are involved in the SIM swap aren't the individuals committing the end crime as such. But once that SIM swap's happened, you've got, maybe an administrator account, or maybe it's somebody's bank account that's got a lot of funds in there. They orchestrate the attack, hit the multi-factor authentication, and then that multi-factor code will appear on the SIM swapped mobile that they've now got access to. They receive that code, then allows them to move forwards into that environment. Worth noting as well, on here we've got EDR. So EDR is almost like antivirus on steroids. So antivirus only detects known threats. So if the AV vendor doesn't know about that threat yet, then your antivirus is not going to detect that. EDR, on the other hand, can detect signature-based threats, but also behavioral threats based on what's happening on that host, and whether or not something on that host is trying to take advantage of a particular executable that's on there, whether there's some other advanced attack going on, or let's say that host then starts trying to have lateral movement from it to other parts of your environment or do other suspicious activity. EDR is capable of picking up all of those things for a SOC to then act on and then take that forwards. Key point to mention this, though, is there are things in place to bypass EDR. There's some stuff on open source intelligence, which you can find on the internet just by searching for it. Or more concerning of recent, there are some commercial vendors out there, which it's meant to be for the greater good to simulate adversaries, but can be used in malicious purposes. So there are vendors out there that are creating, EDR bypass solutions from a commercial perspective that's not documented. And if a threat actor is then able to get an illicit account with that particular vendor, they might be able to use the EDR bypass, which is less known and less detectable. So ever increasing the potential threat of these types of actors. So if we go to the next slide, please. So if we can hand back to you, Scott.
Yep. Cheers. So I mean, the top tip there is right. It's now becoming more, I guess, prominent that the use of what you would call like a push over SMS, for example, to potentially SIM swaps like mobile is something that you want to avoid. So if you're looking at implementing more robust multi-factor authentication methods, the SMS method is becoming obviously less secure. Now, SIM swap's nothing new. It's existed for a long period of time. However, like the fact that we're seeing these attacks more readily and the fact that they're being more successful is obviously something that's worth considering when you're looking at your multi-factor authentication from an adaptive authentication perspective. So there's other ways you can like implement controls around that, but it's just best to avoid SMS. But anyway, that's the first, I guess, tip for the day. So a bit more detail around Scattered Spider. So this group, now there's a mixture of individuals that we've received as being members of the group. Some of us young as 16. Now back in the old days, we used to call these guys script kiddies. So what they would typically do would be search, dark web or readily available open web, sort of open source adversary tools that they could leverage to actually infiltrate networks. So the script kiddie thing, as we called it, were the more like tier 2, tier 3 threat actors. However, they're getting much more complicated. They are now being able to do more impactful and obviously more complex attacks just by leveraging the tools that are becoming more public domain. Now, of course, this network seems to have evolved from activities more associated with financial fraud, social media hacking, and they do have some advanced techniques, but not on a scale if you look at some of the state level actors. But they are heavily involved in corporate network intrusions and extortion campaigns. So we've seen that obviously from the 2 attacks on Marks and Spencers and Co-op. Sorry, excuse me. The skills and financial resources are not tier 1. So a tier 1 capability is, could originate out of one of the more adversarial states, so the likes of Russia, China, North Korea, etc., that do all have state-sponsored cyber attack campaigns. But these guys are more motivated by financial gain, building up, like, I guess, kudos within the networks of these types of threat actors. And obviously, they've been highly successful by broadcasting their name across all of the main news outlets over sort of the April, May, June period when all these attacks were manifested. Okay, next slide, please. So what actually happened, as we've mentioned, is that it was driven by a social engineering attack, right? So somebody's gone in, managed to identify who the suppliers were, what the help desk numbers were. They managed to get someone with a UK accent to then obviously call up this help desk and invoke a password reset to the handset of the phone that's been compromised via a SIM swap, right? So that's how the initial access occurred. It was by leveraging social engineering in conjunction with the SIM swap to get the password reset out. Now, the big thing here that we noticed from the threat reports that we've got from multiple sources, it looks like the ntds.dit file was exfiltrated. Now, that is very dangerous for any organization, because the ntds.dit file is kind of the nerve center for Active Directory. It stands for New Technology Directory Services. The file's been around for quite some time, but compromising this and exfiltrating it is a real headache for enterprises because it's your nerve center. It's got all of your administrator accounts in it, and it has all of the objects that are deployed within Active Directory. So it's a big deal, right? Exfiltrating this file is a big deal. So I'll just hand over to Lee to talk a bit more around the ntds.dit file exfiltration and what that actually means to the organizations that lose control of it.
Cheers, Scott. Before I get onto that, though, just to add a little bit more. So a couple of months ago, FBI started reporting that Scattered Spider had started targeting aviation, and just in the last week, we've seen that there's a news report of Qantas airline becoming compromised, likely through very similar tactics that was used before. And again, with the retail sector, we mentioned Marks and Spencers and Co-op. Throughout that, there was also a compromise of supply chain delivering, frozen goods to the supermarkets as that was taking place. But back onto NTS.dit file. So as a threat actor, when you get into an environment, it's probably the best place that you're going to go for first. It's got the most value to you as a threat actor. It's got your asset inventory in there in some way, shape, or form in the list of a bunch of devices and domains that's in there. But on top of that, you've also got generally, obviously these can be stored in different places, but generally in an environment, you'll have, that's your Active Directory or your domain controller that contains all of your usernames and passwords for all of your users for your environment, both internal and with single sign-on and things like that, probably external as well. And also all of the credentials, secrets, and tickets that your machines will use to communicate with each other in a privileged way. So if the threat actor can get a hold of this, then it's given them the ability to impersonate accounts across your environment. And also, while some of those passwords are encrypted within that database, they can take that from outside of your environment and then brute force or crack a bunch of those passwords offline outside of your environment to either use them externally if they can start to get an inference that there's other third party and maybe other supplier accounts in there that they might be able to leverage by logging into those other environments. You've also got, from a cloud perspective, you might have a cloud infrastructure which is externally accessible, and if they've got hold of some other administrative credentials from there, they could then go and reuse those in your cloud infrastructure. And then on top of that, out in the sort of the dark web world and the dark forums, there's billions of compromised credentials which come from stealing the nts.dit file from within an environment, or compromising a website that's got username and passwords in a database that is used to log into that website, and build big collections of them. They can then try to brute force some of these passwords within the nts.dit file using a massive collection of all those breached credentials and passwords to get further exposure and control over things. So it's a very critical thing to lose from within your environment. And not only that, even if you've, let's say they've used that to ransomware your environment, and move around, you're then in a position where, okay, let's recover from, hopefully you have backups, but let's recover from backups. But all you're doing is recovering yourself back into a vulnerable position from a credential perspective, because you have to assume that the threat actor now knows your username and passwords. So you've just recovered back to a password that could have already been compromised. You're then in a situation, or usually in a situation, where if you've got thousands of users and systems, you've now got to reset the credentials across your whole environment and estate, which can become very challenging and difficult. Not only that, as part of doing that, as part of your recovery, if you now need to reset thousands of users' passwords and their path is back through the service desk to get their credential reset, there's also been examples in the past where threat actors have used that as an avenue to come back into the environment. Cheers for that, Scott.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you can imagine, if this gets compromised, you can't trust it anymore. So you're in a situation where potentially you have to reset all the passwords in your environment. Now, effectively, some of the account I'm working on at the moment, I'm doing some enterprise architecture work, has 26,000 users, right? So imagine having to do resets on that, and the fallout from just being able to process all those potentially through the service desk, and then opening up a potential attack vector while just by definition doing that. So this is a big deal. We can't emphasize how much this is a big deal. Okay, next slide, please. So what are other organizations doing to combat these types of threats? Next slide, please. So, in an ideal world, you go and read Gartner, or you go and read, what should we do to, prevent rather, significant cyber attacks happening in our environment, and they will give you a very long list of potential controls, some of which might be deployed, some of which might be half deployed, and I use that I say that because a lot of organizations have got, for example, Microsoft E5 licensing, and often you can deploy some of these capabilities just by license uplift, and it's not as intrusive. However, if you're looking to deploy the full stack of controls that really would bring you, I guess, up to the most contemporary, N-1 setting that you could get to as a security organization, these things will take a long period of time, right? So The objective of today and insights we'll talk about subsequently is more around what you can do right now. But in terms of a longer term transition and transformation roadmap, these are the sorts of things that we would advise clients to do. However, this is not practical to do in one big hit. This will take, there's potentially 15 to 20 solutions in here that all need to be designed, deployed. You have to go through assurance on them all. So this will take a long time. However, we'll offer up Lee. I mean, if you want to talk around some of these controls, I'll just finish in saying that really, for things that are very contemporary, like secure by design and zero trust architectures, they are a fundamental change in the way you would deploy security and how, it would work in tandem with the rest of your IT assets. That said, when you look at what zero trust architecture actually means, it's not just about adaptive authentication. It's also about how you can reorganize your internal organizational units and your security silos. So looking at more micro segmentation to prevent lateral movement is one of the most powerful things. However, it is a massive change to how you would do solution architecture within the environment. I'll hand over to Lee. So Lee, do you just want to talk around some of these controls and what the benefits they bring up?
Yeah, sure. So I'll not go through every single one, but I'll pick on a few. So on topic, obviously, cybersecurity awareness and training is a key thing with this to ensure that service desks are aware of these tactics and techniques. It's obviously not just scattered spidered using them. There are a lot of threat actors out there using, human manipulation and phishing techniques through the service desk, all the way through to the, anybody that's working on a machine has the ability to become compromised through social engineering. So very important thing. Obviously, we have patching and hardening. Quite a key thing, and is up there with the way that things can end up being compromised. So you've got the human factor, which is still up there at the top, but more so you've got the fact that threat actors will leverage vulnerabilities in software and hardware. You've got opposite scales of that, though. You have state-sponsored threat actors, which may have found a vulnerability in a piece of software or hardware. And, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack to find some of these critical vulnerabilities. So when a threat actor finds them, they try to keep them very well guarded and use them sensibly so they don't get caught using them. But on that side, you've got unknown threats there, because it's not threat researchers that have discovered that. It's, threat actor. So threat actors then leveraging these vulnerabilities to go around compromising systems. And it's not until threat researchers or organizations identify suspicious activity post-compromise within their environment that they then track it back and work out how something was taken advantage of, which transpires to be a critical vulnerability that was unknown. At that point, the vendor can then go and create a patch for that vulnerability, and then everybody can go and patch it. However, you've got that point between the threat actor discovering it, leveraging it, and using it to attack things up until the vendors release the patch, and then onwards from that, which is where the problems get compounded further, is once that threat research is made public, you've then got, as Scott mentioned at the start, some level of script kiddies, which can go and use proof of concepts that are posted out there on the open internet, and then more sophisticated attackers or more handy attackers that can take that threat research and generate their own exploits against those vulnerabilities and then start taking advantage of them. So then every man and his dog essentially can start exploiting that vulnerability. Meanwhile, businesses or a lot of organizations, some are very good at implementing patches very quickly. Some will take a long time to implement patches, sometimes due to not even being aware that there's a patch to implement, and especially on remote access gateways and VPNs, very critical areas to patch. And then sometimes can take months to even implement the patch because they don't want to impact the business, or like I say, by downtime, by implementing patches, or they're just not aware of them. On top of that, though, lead into the EDR side of things. If nothing else, EDR is a good thing to have within your environment. You obviously can't deploy it on absolutely everything because it's typically on a Windows or Linux machine. But what you are able to see is if those machines are being leveraged for additional lateral movement or attacks within your environment, that you've now got an indicator that that's taking place, and your security teams can then step through that to look for the source and track down threat hunt to look how their environment's being attacked and then protect against it. Over the top of all of that, though, you could have all of this implemented, and if a threat actor really wants into your environment, they're just going to keep persisting and trying different opportunities to get in there, which is why it's incredibly important. A lot of organizations will document their incident response plan. Also important to state whilst going through this, that it's not just your cybersecurity teams that need to be up to speed with things like this. You've also got your, all of your technical teams all the way up to the C-level in your business, as well as your business continuity teams and disaster recovery teams. Because whilst cybersecurity is there to protect and detect some of these things and respond in a way to ensure you can recover in a secure manner, you still need to be stepping through the fact that if all your environment's been ransomware, how does your business continue to operate during that period of time? And what are the recovery steps to recover yourself back to a sound working business again, so you can continue to operate throughout that? The reason I say that is I've been involved in a lot of situations now and some cyber simulation exercises where everything's documented very well, but actually stepping through some of that documentation and plans don't materialize into the real world or become an issue to step through them, whether that be through the contacts are now incorrect because it was a couple of years ago and it was written. The person procedure, whilst it seems sound from a documentation perspective, practically doing it is not possible. And then also thinking about all the other areas that could be involved in that recovery. And it's just an important note to mention, it's not just your cybersecurity teams that are involved in that recovery. And just to lead on to a couple of examples, we have previous ad hoc engagement within the gas and oil sector. So it was an outside engagement. There wasn't consuming cybersecurity services from us. They'd gone around and asked a bunch of cybersecurity providers to see whether or not they could help, and rightly or wrongly they dismissed to assist because the customer was saying that they didn't have backups of the data. They'd been ransomwared, and usually if you've been ransomwared, you probably aren't easily going to be able to recover that data, and obviously most of the time, or nearly all of the time, you don't want to be paying a ransom either. So we got approached and we decided to take a look anyway. In the instance we was able to help, did a bit of research, and fortunately for both us and the customer, the ransomware that had been deployed was pretty trivial to break. So we was able to offer that customer the ability to decrypt all of their files from that compromise that occurred for them. And then we went back in and offered them some further recommendations around ensuring that they have EDR products deployed within the environment to have limited that attack that took place, because obviously not only did they ransomware some key finance data, they took over a large portion of their environment as well. And then went in and offered consultation around cybersecurity services, and also recommended that they run back through all of their incident response plans with consultation, of which they didn't actually have any incident response plans. And then they landed up in a situation where not only did they not have the technology to detect what was going on, recover from it, they didn't even have a plan to step through to recover the business from it either. So I was able to significantly help them out. And then there's just generally other ad hoc engagements that I've been engaged in, but they tell a similar story on the opposite end of the scale, where they have a lot of security products in store. They spent a lot of money of them and spent a lot of time trying to ensure that they're correct. But then a state-sponsored attacker manages to leverage a vulnerability on VPN or remote access gateway into that organization, which is the front door into the organization. Manages to leverage that vulnerability, and then from there is able to move laterally back into the environment and then target things like the domain controllers, like we mentioned, the nts.dit. Prime target for a threat actor. Go to that, they can then get more control over the environment and move laterally further, and then targeting their intellectual property and immediately trying to exfiltrate that out of the environment. And then, in worst case scenario, once you've taken that ntds.dit, then got to be in that position we talked about earlier of it's not just a case of recovering your business, so you've got all your data back from backups once everything's been ransomed and encrypted, but you still can't put your business live or fully externally, because all your credentials have, you know, been compromised because they've had the ntds.dit file, and that then has to become an assumption. So then it's a case of having to prioritize which accounts to recover first, and then for some customers recommending additional technologies and process and procedure that can be implemented as part of that credential reset to ensure that you've not got a threat actor coming back in through a credential reset, essentially. All of which then, you know, needs to be feeding into the lessons learned. So after each incident, it can easily get forgotten about because the incident, you know, you've recovered from the incident, it was hard work, it costs a lot of money, but it's then very important that the post-incident lessons learned are followed through to ensure you can feed back into the process and procedure that maybe didn't flow so well whilst trying to recover, and just fundamental gaps and issues that were not there as part of that recovery, which goes back to the first point of ensuring that you're doing cyber simulation exercises to step through all of that and identify those gaps so you can catch them before the big incident happens as such. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Scott.
All right, cheers, Lee. Thanks very much. Next slide, please. So, okay, we've been through that. So, really, we wanted some key takeaways just for you guys or the audience today, to start thinking about that. You know, what we were demonstrating on the slide previously was, yeah, there is tons of controls you could implement. There's lots of best practice that really, you know, if you implement it in your environment, would make you more resilient to cyber attack. However, the big four things that are outcomes from what happened in April and June are these, right? So often strategically, you know, it's better to get four key themes implemented within all of your solutions, and these are the things that we think that organizations should think about strategically. And some of them are simple to execute, some of them are a bit more difficult, but on the whole, you know, the four things that we say is, are you confident that you could recover from a ransomware attack, right? Have you got strategies that are in place to look at what your minimum viable business is? And the minimum viable business is a Gartner term that they came up with that basically defines the actual critical assets that you would need to maintain continuity of operations in the event of a cyber attack. Now, this has given rise to a number of providers that offer cyber recovery as a service. And one of our recommendations is, you know, start to evaluate your recovery procedures and then potentially looking at bringing in a CRAS provider, which could be a managed service or a vendor-specific product, to make sure you've got that immutable vault, which means that you're recovering from a last known good recovery point, rather than, you know, you could have, if the ntds.dit file was compromised, you back that up, you restore it, you're just restoring a compromised asset. So you need to be able to detect the last good control point. This is something that CRAS providers are very good at, and then recover that back into your environment so you can maintain continuity of operations. The second point is probably the easiest one to fix, but the one we see the most in the field that people don't do, and that is make sure that your cyber hygiene is pretty well organized and you are actively managing these risks and threats within your environment. It's too easy to look at vulnerability management output, and you know, you push that out to various teams, and often they don't feedback, you know, what it is, or they feedback that they can't patch these systems. There's various reasons they can't do it, but this is one of the most critical attack vectors. Once something is known in the wild, after that point, the vendors will be releasing patches that will actually defend against a number of these attacks. However, it really is something that we see that most organizations don't do, or if they do it, there's a lot of internal politics around like how remediation occurs, what the SLAs and policies around that are, and how quickly they can deploy a patch to actually mitigate these types of threats. So point two is, how compliant are your business units with patching mandates? The other thing to realize is, you know, there's a lot of vulnerability that will be tied up in your identities. Now, I'll talk on that in a moment, but vulnerability scanning does have the capability to assess where you could have non-compliant identities, you know, service accounts that haven't been used for 6 months to a year, etc., etc. The third point, cybersecurity operations, you need to be heading for a like relative maturity of what we would say on the CMMI scale is between 3 and 4. At Gartner, I used to evaluate a lot of SOCs, and it's difficult to achieve that level of maturity. However, you need to sort of put this down as a strategic imperative And then some of the things that Lee illustrated around like how your cyber response process is run, and all of those things are wrapped up in this particular endeavor. But to demonstrate that level of maturity, you will need to have identified playbooks, incident remediation strategies, containment strategies. And often that helps if that's modeled against NIST, for example. But yeah, it's very important to make sure that your cybersecurity operations is reaching a relative level of maturity to be able to detect and respond to these attacks. So identity also is probably, and we talk less till we're blue in the face. Identity is very important because it's 80% of ransomware attacks are leveraged by compromised identities, right? So making sure your identity perimeter, as we call it, is more secure, and you're actually, actively managing vulnerability within your identity programs is extremely important. However, we do see that identity often is a hodgepodge of different teams, often managing those identities and managing their life cycle. And this is where, on some of the clients we work for, you see thousands of accounts that really are outside policy. Some of them might not have been used. Some of them might, people don't even know anymore what the identity is for. So there is sometimes a perceived risk in shutting the identity down in case it stops an application working or something to that effect. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Yeah, final thoughts. So, back one, sorry. So, final thoughts. You can defend against ransomware attacks. First thing to do is start looking at your patch management, look at system hardening, and identify what your minimum viable business is. If you can ring fence that and make sure that you've got recovery strategies in those solutions, then you've gone a long way to make sure you can defend against ransomware. Recovery in a well drilled, well organized environment can be shut down to can be shut down to about 4 hours. So, for example, M&S and Co-op, if they'd have been able to recover from the attack within 4 hours, then the perception of the public domain would have been completely different. They may not have even heard about the attack, right? So it's very important to have these recovery strategies in place. And again, if you're in the CNI sector or something that's going to be regulated under the NCSE CAF, the UK Cyber Resilience Bill will be looking at how you do this and how you will be in a position to be able to respond to these types of attacks. Two, many organizations, and this is very common, do not have a centralized, and it doesn't have to be centralized, but some sort of coherent function that manages the identity strategy for the organization. If you haven't got this, then minimizing the risk becomes extremely difficult, especially if you're in a hybrid environment, which is complicated by potentially multiple opcos and things like that. So, distinct entities that are managing identities. Across that, you need to get some consistency and make sure that all the identities are managed in a way that you are mitigating these threats actively. People don't look at identity as importantly as they should. It is pivotal. Again, sometimes the responsibility lives outside cybersecurity, so that makes it difficult to make sure that cybersecurity controls are adhered to. However, the recommendation is to make sure you do have a coherent identity function, and that has some teeth to be able to enforce policy across all of your organizational units. So don't underestimate it. IDAM is extremely important. Simple MFA, with password enforcement goes a long way to mitigating some of these threats, but obviously avoid the SMS method for push authentication. So, look at other things like FIDO passkeys or hardware-based tokens, or just make sure you don't use SMS, and your other challenge identity, your identity challenges are not via SMS. Final one is your SOC is your security eyes and ears, right? It's close to my heart. I've done a lot of security operations design. You need to make sure it's got full visibility. It's well drilled in how to respond to cyber attack. It understands, what the current threats are by, using threat intelligence and having threat intelligence tightly integrated within the solutions. And then to Lee's point, make sure that like the recovery processes are documented. Your playbooks for recovery always have a lessons learned sort of type capability that will feedback, what we learn, what we can improve, how we can feedback based on this event into the controls that we've got deployed to improve our cybersecurity posture. But then on top of that, of course, making sure that like your SOC is well drilled is not just for these types of attacks. You know, you're mitigating a cyber threat, plus you're making sure that a lot of these attacks can be mitigated before they hit your environment if you're up to date on your threat intelligence and you're actively managing your environment with threat intelligence in mind. Okay, so on that, I think I'll finish up. So next slide, please, and hand over to Vicky.
I'll just quickly wrap that up. So we've obviously gone through a number of points today. How we can gain the ability to act on the intelligence that we receive and conducting, incident cyber simulation exercises to enhance your posture and your process and procedure. Enhance your identification of cybersecurities. So as Scott's just gone through there around the SOC, but it's worth noting as well that it's all well and good to have lots of tickets and incidents being created for your SOC, but it needs to be managed correctly and ensure that those alerts are actionable and you're not killing your SOC with alert fatigue. As well as that, ensuring that your recovery plans are well tested through and actually work, not just documented. And cultivating that awareness across your organization, through all the way from your service desk to your most privileged administrative users within your environment, to ensure that everybody is aware of how threats can materialize and come through and attack your organization. So then it's not just your cybersecurity teams that are your identifiers around cyber threats, but it's, in a way, your whole organization. And to kind of wrap that through, there will be a QR code just at the end of this presentation. If you are interested, I'd welcome you to scan that code or respond to the email that will come through following this presentation to book a free 30-minute slot with one of our experts within the organisation. Thank you, Vicky. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Scott. I'd like to read out a couple of questions from our attendees, if I may. I'll leave it between you two to decide who will pick it up. From a blank slate, what security-related technology would you implement first?
Do you want me to start, Scott? Or just...
Yeah, go on, you take it out.
Yeah, cool. There's no easy answer to that, but what I would say is from experience, for me, it would be EDR. Obviously, you do need to have consultations, though, to work out what the best thing to implement is. But from a blank slate, it would be EDR. It's not the silver bullet, but it's going to give you the most amount of protection for the money spent, in my opinion. What I would say is part of ad hoc incident response engagements, if the engagement or the customer doesn't have EDR deployed in their environment, that is one of the first things that we do. We get EDR deployed across their environment and then a micro SOC monitoring that EDR platform to look for threats within that environment. And typically, once we do that, so as part of the engagement, they'll get around a month's worth of that EDR deployment within there as part of the engagement. And we do typically see the customers then continue that EDR deployment in their environment and not remove it after that 1 month engagement period. So don't know if you've got anything else to add to that one, Scott, or not. But
no, I mean, all I would add to that is that a lot of places are Microsoft shops now that have got potentially E3 or E3 licensing. What we all typically see from a endpoint detection and response capability, when you look at that Microsoft deployment, they're often not using what they're fully licensed for. So it's very important to maximize what you're getting at. Your E5 licensing, that is a big hit, right? And so also when you say deploy first, normally that's deployed. So you can uplift that by just configuring it correctly and making sure that bang for buck, it's worth spending some money, getting someone in to just make sure that your E5 license is maximized and the controls are used properly. So thank you. Next.
Thanks, guys. Next question. I have a big list of vulnerabilities I should patch. How should I prioritize?
Yeah. So on this one, it's interesting. Like the people are using a lot of AI for this now. So Tenable One, etc., have got or implementing sort of large language models that will help with this prioritization process. That aside, that helps with, like, the vulnerability team. It's important, right? The first things to patch really, and the first things to understand, is the mission critical assets. So making sure that you know what they are is probably the most important thing. So that should feed into the patch management strategy. Now, of course, there's SLAs associated with it. You need to establish those really within your organization so you can get an SLA in terms of when something should be patched and why. In critical national infrastructure, we come across a lot of situations where you might have something connected to an operational technology controller that's sat in a DMZ that you cannot patch, right? And then you need to look at compensating controls. But when it comes to patch priority, it's very much knowing, the importance of various assets, classifying them in such a way that you can leverage an SLA associated with when the patch will be, tested and deployed, but then almost have break glass emergency type situations that mean that you would prioritize some assets over others based on what type of attack it is. So for me, it's very much, you need to understand what your critical assets are, you need to understand what your crown jewels are, and you need to peg an SLA in terms of patch management on that. Also, to what compounds this is often the suppliers are responsible for applying the patches. The thing that I see the most missed is making sure that within the contract, when you agree that with whatever supplier you're engaging that's going to manage your IT assets, you make sure that that's in there and you have the SLAs associated with patch management well defined, well formed. So in summary, to answer your question, it really depends on what your mission critical core assets are and whether you can patch them or not. But yeah, I mean, centralizing it, making sure that you can have all this data sort of stored in ServiceNow, etc., so it becomes more part of IT service management, and also making sure that you can align the IT service management angle with your security function. Again, the world's changing. Security is often sat outside ITSM, but the reality is security is an ITSM thing, right? So it's very much important to make sure that those two are wedded together and they're not separate organizational silos, which is where a lot of things fall through the gaps.
Thank you. Next question. We do the employee training, yet it does not seem to be effective. Any tips here?
Yeah, I agree. So with this, the employee training we're talking about, right, is more for admins and service desks. So generic training that you get for cybersecurity for most organizations, right? They don't train their admins. You might have a generic cybersecurity training course. But when you're training admins, you have to ask them to have that extra step in their mind where they think before they click on what it is they're about to execute, whether this could be a real spear phishing attack, right? So when it comes to spear phishing, it's extremely hazardous because it's going to often potentially be completely structured to one FTE or one supplier FTE that exists within your environment, and it will come up with a very good script. And then there's also side channel things that you could do to influence by potentially, some of the state level actors will do a lot on social media to start generating some of their, bait that they're going to be trying to get some of the internal people that work for your organization to click on, right? So it is very much about training them in the specifics of spear phishing, training them in the threats that could be realized by the attacker by doing, MFA push via SMS, etc., making them aware of these things, because it's often help desk is not. Admins potentially are more aware, but they're often risk averse because they don't feel like they're doing anything wrong. So you have to train your admins, you have to train your service desk, and you have to have specific trainings geared towards them. Service desk, obviously, just being aware of it is one thing, but then also making sure that there's operational procedures where if you suspect that someone's trying to initiate a phishing attack or some sort of spear phishing attack, you can raise that alert directly, even while they're still on the phone, and potentially, mitigate the attack up front. But yeah, it needs to be more targeted training and awareness specifically for admins and specifically for help desk. So not the generic, stuff that you get corporate wise.
And just to add to that as well, Scott, if it's believed that it's not effective, there must be a reason for it. So if that reason is somebody got compromised or there was a compromise, then it's about going back to the root of what occurred there, and then looking at what appropriate training can be given for the cause of the reason why you think it's not effective. It's collecting feedback as well.
Okay, guys. that's all we've got time for today. That concludes our webinar today. I'd like to thank our subject matter experts, Scott and Lee. Thank you very much for sharing your insights, knowledge and experiences. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. We hope you found the session valuable and insightful. Just as a reminder, in recognition of your attendance today, we're offering a complimentary 30-minute follow-up session with our subject matter experts. To request your session, simply scan the QR code on the screen, complete the form with the areas you're interested in having a chat with us, and we'll be in touch shortly. So thank you very much for your time today. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.